History is often written in the blood of warriors on the battlefield. But sometimes the darkest and greatest chapters are written not in ink, but in the screams of a child. And tonight, in the bitter winter of 1457, on a windswept cliff in Wales, an entire dynasty is being born from the agony of a 13-year-old girl. Listen. Through the roar of the Atlantic storm, through the ancient stones of Pembroke Castle, groaning under the wind, there is another sound. A primal sound, sharp and desperate. It is the scream of Margaret Beaufort, inside a sealed room, where the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. Candlelight flickered and danced, casting tall, distorted shadows on the walls. The shadows surrounded a large bed where a small figure was fighting an unequal battle. Margaret, at the age of 13. When other girls braided their hair and passed around fairy tales, was being torn apart by a cruel reality. Her young body, still in the process of development, was now burdened with the extraordinary and cruel task of bringing a new life into the world. Her face was pale, her lips chapped, her golden hair now plastered to her temples with cold sweat. Her eyes, once clear and dreamy, were now wide open, no longer in pure fear, but in utter horror as she realized her body was betraying her, being crushed by an invisible force from within. Each contraction came like a tsunami, drowning her in an ocean of pain with no way out. She bit down on a piece of linen to keep from biting her tongue, but the moans stuck in her throat still couldn't stop the screams that came out as the pain reached its peak. Around her, the midwives, women with faces hardened by countless births and deaths, looked helpless. They whispered to each other in Old Welsh, prayers mingled with soft curses at the cruelty of fate. They had delivered hundreds of babies, but they had never seen anything like this. A child trying to give birth to a child. It was an affront to nature, a cruel consequence of the cold politics of the world outside these walls. They used every ounce of knowledge they had, from rubbing her with aromatic oils, giving her bitter herbal potions, to placing holy relics on her cramping belly. But it was all in vain. The baby was too big, and the mother's pelvis was too small. They knew she was dying. The look they exchanged said it all. They had no hope of saving the mother. Now they could only pray to save the child, because the child in her womb was no ordinary being. It was the last drop of blood, the only hope of the Lancaster family in the bloody civil war that was tearing England apart. It was the future of a faction on the brink of collapse. Its life could decide the fate of an entire kingdom. And Margaret, though in the fog of pain, seemed to understand it. In her delirium, she clutched a small cross, the one she had carried with her since leaving her home. She did not pray for herself to live. She prayed for her child to live. She accepted this sacrifice. But fate had other plans. This pain would not destroy her. It would rebirth her. From the ashes of her physical agony, an iron will, an extraordinary resilience would rise. The fragile girl screaming on her deathbed would disappear, giving way to a woman who would use her wisdom and ruthlessness to change the course of history. This was not a story of death. This was a story of birth, not just the birth of a king, but the birth of a queen without a throne, a great mother who would dedicate her life to bringing this son born in suffering to the pinnacle of power. What makes a person's blood so precious that it can rob them of their childhood? What makes bloodline a golden ticket, but also a hanging death sentence? To answer that question, we must look to the storm that engulfed England in the mid-15th century. A storm that was not made of clouds and wind, but of ambition, betrayal, and family feuds. This was the era of the Wars of the Roses, a poetic name, but one of the most brutal and fratricidal civil wars in history. Forget the lofty ideals. This was a naked struggle for power between two branches of the same royal house, the House of Lancaster, whose symbol was the red rose, and the House of York, whose symbol was the white rose. Both believed they had the rightful claim to the throne. The spark for war was a vacuum at the top of power. The reigning king, Henry VI of Lancaster, was a pious, gentle man, but utterly unfit to be king. He was weak, indecisive, and suffering from bouts of insanity that made him unable to rule. As the leader of the pack weakened, the pack fought for his place. The English aristocracy, already filled with powerful lords with private armies, began to split. The country was in chaos, the law was disregarded, and the sword became the instrument to settle disputes. And into that furnace, Margaret Beaufort was born. She was no ordinary chess piece. She was a queen on this bloody chessboard. Why? Because of the blood that ran through her veins. Margaret was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the powerful third son of King Edward III. In an age when inheritance and legitimacy were everything, her lineage was an almost direct path to the throne. Despite some doubts about the legitimacy of her family tree, in the eyes of Lancaster supporters, she was the embodiment of legitimate succession. Her bloodline was a weapon. Whoever married her would not only gain the vast Beaufort fortune, but also a strong claim to the English throne. Her life became an auction from an early age. Her father died when she was 1, leaving his only daughter as the richest heiress in the kingdom. Her mother, a shrewd and practical woman, knew she could not protect her daughter alone. The only way was to use Margaret's own worth to forge a strong alliance. At the age of 6, she was betrothed to the son of the Duke of Suffolk, one of the most powerful men in England. It was her first lesson in politics. She was not a person, she was an asset. But then the Duke of Suffolk fell from power and was assassinated. The alliance fell apart, and Margaret, at the age of 7, was used as a pawn in a new game. This time the game took her to the Tudors. Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, did not have the ancient lineage of the other great nobles. But he had something even more valuable, a close connection to the throne. Edmund was the half-brother of the reigning king, Henry VI. A marriage between Margaret and Edmund would create an ironclad alliance, cementing the position of the House of Lancaster and producing heirs of unquestionable royal blood. And so, the fate of the 12-year-old girl was sealed. She was taken to the altar to marry a stranger, a generation older than her. No one asked her if she wanted to. No one cared that her body and soul were not ready. She was just a tool, a sacrifice on the altar of dynastic ambition. The stormy blood that flowed through her veins had brought her status and wealth, but it had also robbed her of her childhood, and soon it would demand a much higher price. For most women throughout history, becoming a widow was a tragedy, marking the end of a chapter in life. But for Margaret Beaufort, at the age of 13, the widow's veil was not the end. It was the beginning of a nightmare, a sentence of exile where she faced the darkness alone. Her marriage to Edmund Tudor lasted just over a year. It was not a love story. It was a cold duty, a transaction made by powerful adults. To Edmund, a man in his 20s, Margaret was a precious bride, a key to the family's rise. To Margaret, he was a stranger, a man she had to call her husband, who had transformed her from a child into a pregnant woman in just a few short months. She lived in silent confusion and fear, trying to play the role that fate had imposed on her. Then tragedy struck, swift as a knife. While Edmund was leading an army in Wales to quell the Yorkist rebellion, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. A few weeks later, news came. He was dead. The official cause was the bubonic plague, a common disease and a perfect excuse in medieval prisons. But no one believed it. There were whispers of assassination, a ruthless Yorkist attempt to eliminate the king's brother. Put yourself in Margaret's shoes. One stormy November evening, she sat in the chapel, perhaps praying for the safety of her estranged husband. Suddenly, the door swung open. A messenger, covered in mud and panting from a long journey, carried a letter. She didn't need to read it. The messenger's desperate eyes said it all. Her fragile world, already full of cracks, was shattered into pieces. What did she feel? Perhaps it wasn't the pain of losing a loved one, because she hadn't had time to know or love him. It was a far more terrifying feeling: desolation. The only man who had been her protector was gone. She, a 13-year-old child, carrying the blood of the House of Tudor, was now completely exposed to enemies who were searching everywhere. She was no longer a valuable heiress to be fought over. She was a threat that had to be destroyed. She and her unborn child were living symbols of the Lancaster succession, and the Yorks would never let that symbol live. In the most desperate moment, a protector appeared. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, a brave warrior and loyal to the House of Lancaster. He saw more than a pitiful sister-in-law. He saw the future of his family and his faction in that girl's womb. He knew he had to act. Jasper made a snap decision: take Margaret to the safest place he knew, his impregnable fortress, Pembroke Castle. The journey there was an exile. Margaret, in the last months of her pregnancy, had to be carried by palanquin over the worst winter roads. The road was no longer a road, but a muddy, frozen puddle. Every jolt of the palanquin was a stab to her tired, aching body. A cold wind blew through the cracks, and fear was colder than the wind. At any moment, a band of Yorkists might emerge from the woods. Every shadow of a tree, every strange sound, made her heart clench. For 5 days she huddled in the cramped palanquin, one hand on her stomach, the other clutching a cross, praying silently. At last they arrived. Pembroke Castle loomed high on the cliffs, a huge gray, cold mass of rock surrounded by the whitecaps of the Atlantic. It might have been safe from outside enemies, but to Margaret it felt like a glorified prison. The towering stone walls kept the Yorkists out, but they also held her in, her fear, her loneliness, and the terrible ordeal that lay ahead. As the heavy iron gates slammed shut behind her, she knew she was cut off from the world. Here, in this lonely fortress, she would face the greatest and most painful battle of her life alone. Every throne is built on sacrifice, sacrifice of territory, sacrifice of gold, and sacrifice of the lives of thousands of soldiers. But the throne that was about to be born in this room demanded a price far more primal and cruel. It demanded the sacrifice of the body, the soul, and the entire future of the young mother who created it. This was the price of a dynasty. When the first contractions hit, Margaret thought they were just ordinary stomach cramps. But the pain quickly became intense. Something strange and terrifying was taking over her body. The experienced midwives immediately realized the harsh truth. They exchanged worried glances. This was not the labor of a grown woman. This was the body of a child being torn apart from the inside. The room quickly became a battlefield. The fires in the hearth grew larger. Large pots of water were boiled, and pungent herbs were burned. Their smoke thick in the air, a desperate attempt to ward off evil spirits and ease the pain. But nothing could ease the pain. Time lost its meaning. Day turned into night, and then night stretched on forever. 18 hours. Imagine. 18 hours of relentless torture. The initial pain, though intense, had its breaks. But then those breaks grew shorter and shorter until they disappeared altogether, leaving only a never-ending tsunami of pain. Margaret's screams echoed through the castle at first, but then they faded, turning into hoarse moans and finally into ragged gasps like those of a wounded animal. Dr. Louis Cherlayan, one of the best physicians of his time, was helpless. 15th century medicine was a mixture of ancient wisdom, folk wisdom, and deep superstition. He tried everything. He gave her bitter tonics to strengthen her, but she threw up most of them. He chanted prayers in her ear, but God did not seem to listen. On a small table covered with a white cloth, his and the midwives' instruments were laid out, gleaming in the candlelight. Small knives, tongues, and iron hooks. They were meant to save lives, but they looked more like instruments of torture. Every time Margaret glanced at them, her horror grew. As the second day dawned through the narrow window, the situation was desperate. Margaret had lost too much blood. Fever was setting in. She was delirious, mumbling nonsense. The baby in her womb was dying too, its weak heartbeat a testament to the struggle that was drawing to a close. Dr. Cherlayan and the head midwife knew that they had only one choice, a last, barbaric onesie to manually remove the baby. It was a life or death gamble, with a very low chance of saving the baby, and a near 100% chance that the mother would die from blood loss and infection. In that moment, as the midwife prepared to make her final move, Margaret seemed to come to her senses. She looked at them, eyes wide, and shook her head. But it wasn't a refusal, it was an acceptance. She was willing to die so that her child could live. And then, in a final effort by both mother and rescuers, amid a sea of blood and tears, the child was born. There was a moment of suffocating silence. Then, a weak but strong wail pierced the deadly air. Henry Tudor had come into the world. They placed the tiny creature, red and bloody, on his mother's chest for a moment. Margaret, through a haze, saw her son's face for the first and possibly last time. She had done her duty. But Margaret did not die. With some extraordinary willpower, she clung to life. However, the price of that survival was enormous. A few days later, when she was out of danger, the doctor informed her of a cruel truth. The violent birth had completely destroyed her reproductive organs. The internal tears were too deep. The damage was irreversible. She would never be able to conceive again. At the age of 13, her life as a mother had begun and ended in a single night of terror. Her entire reproductive future had been exchanged for a single son. In the weeks that followed, she battled fever and infection. But as her body recovered, a greater change took place in her soul. The pain and sacrifice did not turn into bitterness. They turned into purpose. She looked at her baby boy, the product of all her suffering, and she made a silent vow. Her sacrifice could not be in vain. This child would not just live. He would be king. The price she had paid was too great. It could only be repaid with a crown. There are many ways to fight a war. Some fight with swords and armor on the battlefield, but others, more dangerous and resilient, fight with smiles, with silence, and with moves calculated in the dark for years. After surviving a hell no one could have imagined, Margaret Beaufort chose to become such a warrior. She took away her scream and replaced it with a mask. Consider her situation after giving birth. A 14-year-old widow. Her body scarred by never-ending wounds, with a newborn child. That child was both the greatest love of her life and the most dangerous burden. In the cruel chessboard of the Wars of the Roses, they were a king without a guard, completely exposed to the attacks of the enemy. Any York lord could have done meritorious service by clearing the last threat from the House of Lancaster. Their weakness was an invitation to death. Margaret, with a maturity that belied her years, understood this. Love and loyalty could not protect her son. Only the power of an enemy could. And so she made a decision that many considered unthinkable. Even treasonous, she would remarry, and her new husband would be a Yorkist. It was a bold and cold move. Sir Henry Stafford, the son of one of the most powerful Yorkist families, became her second husband. By entering into this marriage, Margaret had taken on the mantle of the enemy. She had transformed herself and her son from targets to family. It was a perfect act of self-defense, a way to hide in the middle of the tiger's den. But this was not a surrender. It was a strategic negotiation. Margaret and her mother had negotiated the terms of the marriage contract with extraordinary wisdom and foresight. First, Margaret would retain full control of the vast Beaufort estate. This would ensure her financial independence, a vital weapon. She would not have to rely on the kindness of her husband. Second, and this was a stroke of genius, she convinced the Staffords to accept a nearly unheard of provision. Her son, Henry Tudor, would not live with his mother and stepfather. He would continue to be raised in a safe, remote part of Wales under the guardianship of his loyal uncle Jasper Tudor. Think about it. She had taken away the Yorks' greatest weapon. They couldn't use Henry as a hostage. They couldn't, accidentally, cause an accident. He was safe, out of the reach of the royal court, and would continue to be raised with absolute loyalty to the House of Lancaster. Margaret's life became a drama. She assumed the persona of Lady Stafford, the dutiful wife, the devout woman, seemingly resigned to her fate and forgetting her Lancastrian past. She attended Yorkist parties, smiled and toasted the health of King Edward, IV, her family's sworn enemy. She listened to the taunts about the failed Lancastrians, and appeared cheerful among those who might have ordered the murder of her first husband. Can you imagine the inner turmoil and mental strength required to live such a life? Every day was a silent battle. Every smile was a tactic. Every kind word was an act of intelligence. Behind that gentle and resigned exterior was a mind that worked tirelessly. She watched. She listened. She learned to distinguish friend from foe, to recognize the cracks within the Yorkist camp, and to quietly build her own network of allies. Gone was the innocent girl who had screamed in the delivery room. In her place was a woman who had learned that in the Game of Thrones, the most powerful weapon is not the sword, but patience, intelligence, and a mask that never falls. She was prepared to wait, even if it took decades, for the day when that mask would be removed and the sword of vengeance unsheathed. Hope is a dangerous thing. It can be a torch that can help you through the darkest nights, but it can also burn your soul when cruelly extinguished. In 1471, for Margaret Beaufort, the last flame of hope she had secretly nurtured for 14 years was blown out to sea by a fateful wind. That year, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, the Lancastrians suffered a devastating and final defeat. Their army was crushed, and more importantly, Edward, Prince of Wales, the last heir and greatest hope of the Red Rose, was killed on the battlefield. At the same time, King Henry VI was also mysteriously assassinated in the Tower of London. The direct Lancaster line was extinct. In an instant, the political chessboard was turned. Margaret's 14-year-old son, Henry Tudor, had gone from being a minor character in the play to being thrust into the center of the stage. Despite his ambiguities, his bloodline was now the House of Lancaster's only remaining claim. He was no longer a boy. He was a living threat, a symbol that could rally all of York's enemies. And the victorious King Edward IV, never one to shy away from eliminating his rivals, was not about to let that threat remain. Jasper Tudor knew this better than anyone. To stay was to die. He and Henry were on the run. It was a dramatic escape as the Yorkist army closed in. They raced against time, reached the port of Tenby, and boarded a small ship to the unknown exile. Margaret was not there to say goodbye. She did not get to hug her son one last time or tell him to be careful. She was in England, trapped in enemy territory, and only learned of his death days later, in a short, cold text message. Her son was gone. Try to feel her pain. It was not the pain of a mother who had lost a child to death. It was probably a more lasting mental torture. Her son was still alive, somewhere out there, but she could not see him, could not touch him, could not even be sure if he was safe. She had watched him grow up from afar for the first 14 years of his life. Now she faced the prospect of never seeing him again. She could only imagine her son, a 14-year-old boy, alone in a strange land, hunted and learning to survive. This kind of pain could easily break any woman, turning them into a shadow of despair. But Margaret Beaufort was not just any woman. Grief did not break her. It fueled her. Her motherly love was tempered into a steely resolve. She would not mourn. She would act, not long after her second husband died. Once again, she was free. And she made the boldest and most brilliant political move of her life. She married for the third time to Lord Thomas Stanley. Stanley was not a man of any faction. He was loyal to only one thing's power and survival. He was a master of the art of politics, a cunning fox who knew how to bet on the right side at the right time. Margaret and Stanley's marriage was not one of love. It was a union of two master strategists. Each saw in the other a tool for his own ambitions. With Lady Stanley's protection and status, Margaret transformed herself into the perfect spy. She lived at the heart of the Yorkist court, smiling at the king while her hands silently wove a vast web of intrigue. Over the course of those 14 years, she became the Queen of Spies. She used her wealth to finance her son and his exiled court in Brittany. She built an elaborate intelligence network, using priests, merchants, and even pilgrims to carry messages and coded messages. Every day of those 14 years, she lived in two worlds. By day, she was the venerable Lady Stanley, a pious and seemingly harmless lady. But by night, she was the brains of the resistance, the mother who used all her wits and patience to pave the way for her son's return. She lived with a constant fear that one day the messenger would bring the news she dreaded most. But that fear did not slow her down. It only made her more calculating, more patient. She was waiting for a crack in the York walls. And she knew that if she waited long enough, that crack would surely appear. In the Game of Thrones, the strongest person doesn't always win. Sometimes, it's the most patient, the one who knows how to wait for the moment when the opponent makes a mistake. For 14 long years, Margaret Beaufort waited in the shadows, weaving her web with threads of silence and patience. And then, in the spring of 1483, a sudden death at court created the crack she had been waiting for. That crack would soon become a seismic event that would shake the kingdom. King Edward IV, the great Yorkist warrior who had decisively defeated the Lancastrians, died suddenly at the age of 40. His death was not entirely unexpected to those close to him. He had led a life of indulgence and overindulgence, but it plunged England into immediate crisis. The throne passed to his son, a 12-year-old boy named Edward V. History had shown that there was nothing more dangerous than a child king. True power lay in the hands of the regent, and a bloody struggle for that position was inevitable. The man who emerged from the shadows to seize power was the late king's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was a complex figure, a brave warrior, a talented administrator, but also consumed by a dark ambition. He acted with astonishing speed and ruthlessness. Under the pretext of protecting his two nephews, King Edward V and his brother, Richard took them to the Tower of London. And then the gates of that infamous tower closed behind them forever. Richard declared his brother's marriage illegitimate, and thus the two younger princes were bastards with no right to inherit. They then disappeared from history without a trace. The princes in the tower became one of England's greatest and darkest mysteries. The entire kingdom believed that Richard had murdered his own nephew to usurp the throne. In July 1483, he ascended the throne as King Richard III. For Margaret Beaufort, Richard's actions were a godsend. Richard may have won the crown, but he had destroyed what mattered most: the legitimacy and loyalty of his own faction. Many of the Yorkist nobles, who had fought so hard for King Edward IV, were now disgusted by the usurper's actions. They could no longer serve a king suspected of infanticide. Suddenly, the enemy of her enemy became her friend. Margaret, from her room, saw a golden opportunity. She sprang into action, and her first move was a masterstroke of diplomacy. She secretly contacted the widow of King Edward IV, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, the woman who had been her sworn enemy. The two women, one Lancaster, one York, two mothers who had lost everything, put aside their hatred to form an unlikely alliance. Together they hatched a plan. Henry Tudor would return, overthrow Richard III, and then marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, uniting the red and white roses, ending the Civil War forever. It was a perfect plan, with the backing of both loyal Lancastrians and disaffected Yorkists. Margaret organized a full-scale uprising in October 1483. The plans were drawn up, the rebels were ready, and Henry Tudor and his fleet set sail from Brittany. For the first time in years, victory seemed within reach. But fate once again played tricks on her. Margaret's first big bet failed miserably. A terrible storm at sea scattered Henry's fleet, forcing him to turn back. Meanwhile, betrayal revealed the plan in England. Richard Ether, a brilliant military commander, acted swiftly and brutally. The rebellion was put down in blood. Many of Margaret's allies and friends were captured and executed. She could only watch helplessly as the network she had spent years building was destroyed. She herself faced execution for treason. But once again, her cunning husband Thomas Stanley saved her. He may have convinced Richard III that executing such a powerful woman would cause more unrest than deterrence. Margaret survived, but was severely punished. Her estates and titles were stripped and placed in the care of her husband. She was placed under house arrest, closely watched. To the world, Margaret Beaufort was defeated, neutralized. She had played her cards and lost. But Richard III and the world had made a fatal mistake. They could imprison her body, but they could not imprison her mind, which immediately began planning her second and final gamble. It is often said that a lion in a cage is more dangerous than one in the wild. Confined to her own home, stripped of her titles and possessions, Margaret Beaufort had never been more dangerous. King Richard III thought he had neutralized her, reduced her to nothing more than a prisoner. But he was fatally mistaken. He had only imprisoned her body, but could not chain her great mind and a will forged in the fires of hell. From her prison cell, Margaret weaved the final threads of the web she had been spinning for nearly 3 decades. She was like a spider, sitting motionless at the center, but sensing every tremor in her web. Through her husband, Thomas Stanley, who was given free access, she continued to direct the resistance. Her letters became more elaborately coded, her secret meetings more cleverly arranged. She forged frayed alliances, seeking new allies from the Yorkists, who had grown increasingly disgusted with Richard's tyrannical rule. She was not planning just a battle. She was planning a dynasty. 2 years after the disaster of the first uprising, in August 1485, the cobwebs were drawn. Henry Tudor, armed with funding and invaluable intelligence from his mother, once again set sail for England. This time no storms stood in his way. He landed in the same Welsh soil where he had been born and raised, with a small but determined army. When Richard III heard the news, he laughed. What could a nameless exile with a handful of mercenaries do? He would assemble a vast royal army, many times larger than the king, to crush this petty threat once and for all. All England held its breath. All eyes were on one family, the Stanleys. Margaret Beaufort's husband and brother-in-law commanded the strongest army in the north. Would they stay loyal to the current king, Richard III, or would they flip their cards and back the challenger? On August 22, 1485, 2 armies faced each other on a wet field near the town of Bosworth. It was a majestic and terrifying sight. On one side stood King Richard III, clad in shining armor, a seasoned warrior, fighting desperately to keep his throne. On the other stood Henry Tudor, a young man who had never commanded a battle, but who carried within him 30 years of Lancastrian hatred and hope. And on a nearby hill, standing apart, stood the Stanley army, their banners fluttering in the wind, silent as a judge passing judgment on the fate of their rivals. The battle began. Richard's army, outnumbered, gradually gained the upper hand. Henry Tudor and his small army were in danger of being surrounded and annihilated. Seeing this, Richard III decided to make a bold but risky move. He would personally lead a suicide squad through the chaos and behead Henry Tudor, ending the battle with a single blow. It was a cinematic moment. Richard, like a god of war, was charging straight at Henry. He was so close that he could have killed Henry's standard bearer. The future of England hung in the balance, and at that crucial moment, when Henry seemed certain to die, Margaret Beaufort, hundreds of miles away, made her final move. The Stanleys finally moved. They did not charge to save King Richard. They charged straight into the flank of the death squad, driving a knife into the king's back. It was the betrayal Margaret had been planning and waiting for all these years. Richard III was surrounded, thrown from his horse, but he refused to surrender. He fought like a king to the last breath. When the battle was over, Richard's crown was found thrown off and stuck in a bush. It was picked up, cleaned of dirt, and placed on Henry Tudor's head, right there on the battlefield. There was a great cheer. "Long live the king!" The Wars of the Roses were over. The Tudor dynasty had begun. A few weeks later, Margaret and Henry had the reunion she had waited 14 years for. Her son was now King Henry VII, and she was no longer just Margaret Beaufort or Lady Stanley. She was given a unique title, My Lady the King's Mother. She became the king's most powerful woman, his closest advisor. She lived to see her son marry the York princess, truly uniting the two families. She lived to see her grandson, the future Henry V, born from a screaming, physically broken 13-year-old girl to a lonely child widow, a double-dealing wife, a shadowy strategist, and finally a powerful queen mother. Margaret Beaufort's life is an extraordinary testament to the power of human will and a mother's love. That love, forged in the hellfire of loss and suffering, became a weapon powerful enough to end a civil war and give birth to one of history's greatest dynasties.